September 8, 1944. 6:43 p.m. Chiswick, London. Mary Clark was preparing dinner in her kitchen when the world ended without warning. No air raid siren, no aircraft engine sound, no whistle of falling bombs. Just a thunderous explosion that demolished 3 houses, killed 3 people instantly, and created a crater 30 feet across. Rescue workers arriving at the scene found destruction unlike anything they'd witnessed during 4 years of German bombing. The blast pattern suggested an enormous explosive device, but there was no evidence of an aircraft, no bomb fragments, nothing that explained what had created such devastation. 6 miles away in Westminster, British intelligence officers received reports of the Chiswick explosion with grim recognition. They had been expecting this for months. German rocket development had been tracked through intelligence reports, reconnaissance photographs, and interrogations of German scientists who had defected or been captured. The weapons were called Vergeltungswaffe, Vengeance Weapon 2, or simply V-2. They were ballistic missiles, the first operational guided weapons in history, and the explosion in Chiswick announced that Germany had begun using them against London. What made the V-2 terrifying wasn't just its destructive power, though the 1-ton warhead was formidable. It was the impossibility of defense. The rocket launched from occupied Europe, climbed to altitudes exceeding 50 miles, traveled at speeds over 3,500 miles per hour, and struck targets over 200 miles away. No interceptor aircraft could reach it. No anti-aircraft gun could track it. No radar could provide warning sufficient for civilians to take shelter. The weapon arrived faster than sound, meaning the explosion was the first indication of attack. Londoners who survived V-2 strikes described hearing the explosion before hearing the incoming rocket's sonic boom, a reversal of normal cause and effect that captured the weapon's otherworldly nature. The story of the V-2 begins not in 1944, but in the 1920s, when a generation of German engineers and enthusiasts became fascinated with rocketry as a means of space exploration. The Treaty of Versailles, imposed after World War I, prohibited Germany from developing military aircraft, tanks, and various conventional weapons. But rockets weren't mentioned in the treaty because no one in 1919 considered them militarily relevant. This oversight created a legal loophole that allowed German rocket experimentation to proceed without violating treaty restrictions. Wernher von Braun, born in 1912 to Prussian aristocracy, became obsessed with spaceflight after reading science fiction and theoretical works on rocket propulsion. He studied physics and engineering at the Technical University of Berlin, writing his doctoral dissertation on rocket theory, while simultaneously conducting practical experiments with small liquid-fuel rockets. Von Braun's combination of theoretical knowledge and practical skill attracted attention from the German military, which was quietly searching for weapons that could circumvent Versailles Treaty restrictions. In 1932, the German Army's Weapons Department hired von Braun to develop military rockets. The work was classified, conducted at a remote testing facility, and focused initially on small rockets for potential use as artillery. But von Braun's ambitions extended far beyond artillery. He envisioned rockets capable of reaching the edge of space, traveling hundreds of miles, and delivering payloads with precision that conventional weapons couldn't match. The military was skeptical but provided funding, because rocket development remained technically legal under Versailles restrictions. The technical challenges were enormous. Liquid fuel rockets required combining fuel and oxidizer in combustion chambers at precise ratios, controlling combustion temperatures that could melt engine components, directing thrust to provide stable flight, and guiding the rocket to hit intended targets. Each problem required solving dozens of sub-problems, from metallurgy capable of withstanding extreme temperatures to gyroscopes sensitive enough to detect tiny deviations from planned flight paths. The work required advances in multiple engineering disciplines simultaneously. By 1937, Von Braun's team had grown to over 80 engineers and technicians working at Peenemünde, a facility on the Baltic coast chosen for its remoteness and proximity to overwater test ranges. The team's progress impressed military leadership enough to increase funding and priority. Adolf Hitler, after seeing a demonstration of an early rocket in 1939, declared rocketry a priority weapon development program. The increased support allowed von Braun to pursue his vision of a true ballistic missile, rather than the incremental improvements to artillery rockets that military leadership initially wanted. The weapon that emerged from this development was designated Aggregate 4, or A4, in technical documentation. It stood 46 feet tall, weighed 27,600 pounds fully fueled, and carried a 2,200-pound Amatol warhead. The propulsion system burned a mixture of ethanol and liquid oxygen, producing 56,000 pounds of thrust for approximately 65 seconds. This was sufficient to accelerate the missile to over 3,500 miles per hour and reach altitudes exceeding 50 miles before the engine cut off, and the missile followed a ballistic trajectory to the target. The guidance system was revolutionary for 1942. Gyroscopes mounted in the missile measured deviations from the planned trajectory. An analog computer processed gyroscope data and commanded graphite vanes in the rocket exhaust to adjust thrust direction, steering the missile back to the planned flight path. The system worked autonomously once the missile launched, requiring no further input from ground controllers. This was true guidance, distinguishing the V-2 from previous rockets that flew on fixed trajectories determined at launch. The first successful flight came on October 3, 1942, when an A4 flew 118 miles and impacted within 2.5 miles of the intended target. Von Braun and his team celebrated what they recognized as a historic achievement: the first human-made object to reach space, the first guided ballistic missile, and the first demonstration that rockets could deliver weapons across distances conventional artillery couldn't reach. General Walter Dornberger, military director of the program, sent a message to Hitler declaring that the spaceship is born. But transforming an experimental success into an operational weapon required solving manufacturing, logistics, and deployment challenges as difficult as the original engineering problems. Each missile required precision components manufactured to tolerances that German industry struggled to achieve. The guidance system alone contained over 30,000 individual parts. The liquid oxygen used as oxidizer had to be manufactured, stored at cryogenic temperatures, and transported to launch sites. Launch operations required specialized crews trained in procedures that were dangerous and complex. Scaling from occasional test launches to sustained operational deployment represented an enormous undertaking. Hitler's response to the successful test was characteristically grandiose. He envisioned thousands of missiles overwhelming Britain, forcing surrender through terror bombing that conventional weapons couldn't match. He ordered immediate mass production despite warnings from von Braun and Dornberger that the weapon hadn't been adequately tested and that manufacturing capabilities didn't exist for the production rates Hitler demanded. The pressure to produce operational missiles before they were truly ready would plague the V-2 program throughout its deployment. Manufacturing was assigned to the Mittelwerk, an underground factory complex built inside tunnels excavated from mountains in central Germany. The facility was constructed using concentration camp labor under horrific conditions. Prisoners worked 18-hour shifts in poorly ventilated tunnels, suffered from malnutrition and disease, and died in thousands from overwork, starvation, and casual execution by guards. The V-2 production program's death toll among forced laborers exceeded 20,000, far more than the approximately 9,000 people killed by V-2 strikes against Allied targets. The moral dimension of V-2 development creates impossible tensions in historical assessment. The technical achievement was extraordinary. The guidance and propulsion systems represented revolutionary advances that shaped post-war space exploration and missile development. But the achievement was purchased with slave labor, deliberate disregard for human life, and service to a regime conducting systematic genocide. Von Braun and other engineers claimed after the war that they were focused on technical work and weren't responsible for how the regime used their creations or the labor conditions in production facilities. This claim has been disputed by historians who found evidence that von Braun and other senior engineers knew about concentration camp labor and were complicit in its use. The first operational V-2 launch against Paris occurred on September 6, 1944, 2 days before the Chiswick strike. The missile failed to reach Paris, crashing in countryside with no casualties. The Chiswick attack 2 days later was the first successful strike against a civilian target, marking the beginning of a campaign that would last until March 1945. Over those 7 months, approximately 3,000 V-2 missiles were launched, with roughly 1,400 striking London and another 1,700 targeting Antwerp, which had become crucial to Allied logistics after its liberation. The Allied response to V-2 attacks revealed the weapon's fundamental invulnerability to conventional defenses. Fighter aircraft couldn't intercept missiles traveling at supersonic speeds. Anti-aircraft guns couldn't track targets moving faster than their shells. Radar provided no useful warning because missiles arrived within seconds of detection. The only effective countermeasure was attacking launch sites, production facilities, and supply networks. But mobile launch operations meant that bombing suspected launch areas rarely destroyed actual launchers, which moved after firing and could set up in new locations within hours. British intelligence, desperate to find countermeasures, studied every aspect of V-2 operations. They analyzed impact patterns to backtrack launch locations. They interrogated captured German personnel familiar with rocket operations. They conducted reconnaissance flights over suspected production and storage facilities. The intelligence picture that emerged was sobering. The V-2 was essentially invulnerable to direct defensive measures. The only hope was disrupting production and supply to limit the number of missiles Germany could launch. The accuracy of V-2 missiles was poor by modern standards, but revolutionary for 1944. The guidance system could steer missiles to within 5–10 miles of intended targets under ideal conditions, though atmospheric conditions, manufacturing variations, and guidance system limitations often resulted in much larger dispersions. Against large area targets like London or Antwerp, this accuracy was sufficient to ensure hits within the target area. Against specific facilities or military targets, the weapon was essentially useless, as likely to hit empty fields as intended targets. This limitation meant the V-2 was primarily a terror weapon rather than a militarily effective one. Each missile cost approximately $120,000 in 1944 dollars, equivalent to roughly $2 million today. The explosive payload of 2,200 pounds was comparable to a single conventional bomb, which cost a tiny fraction of the missile. From a purely military economic perspective, the V-2 was spectacularly inefficient. Germany spent enormous resources on weapons that killed fewer than 10,000 people over 7 months, when the same resources devoted to conventional weapons or defensive measures might have had far greater military impact. German leadership recognized this inefficiency, but continued the program for psychological and political reasons. Hitler believed terror weapons would break British morale and force negotiations. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels promoted V-2 attacks as evidence of German technological superiority and inevitable victory, despite military setbacks. The weapons provided propaganda value that outweighed military ineffectiveness, at least in the regime's calculation. Whether this calculation was rational is debatable, but it explains why V-2 production continued until war's end despite questionable military utility. The experience of living under V-2 bombardment created unique psychological effects. Unlike conventional bombing, which provided warning through air raid sirens and allowed people to seek shelter, V-2 strikes were instantaneous and without warning. The randomness of impacts, which could destroy one house while leaving neighbors untouched, created anxiety that constant bombardment with conventional weapons couldn't match. Londoners developed fatalistic attitudes toward V-2 attacks, recognizing that no precautions could provide protection and that survival was purely chance. The British government's response emphasized maintaining morale through information control and stoic messaging. Initial V-2 strikes weren't publicly attributed to rockets, with official statements referring to exploding gas mains to avoid causing panic. This deception lasted only weeks before the truth became common knowledge, at which point the government shifted to acknowledging V-2 attacks while emphasizing that they were militarily insignificant and wouldn't affect the war's outcome. This messaging was accurate, but provided cold comfort to families who lost loved ones to weapons that arrived without warning. The technical intelligence gathered from V-2 fragments recovered after strikes revealed the sophistication of German engineering. British and American scientists examining guidance components, engine parts, and structural elements recognized that the Germans had achieved breakthroughs in multiple fields. The analog computers that processed guidance data were more sophisticated than anything Allied forces had developed. The fuel injectors that mixed ethanol and liquid oxygen achieved combustion stability that Allied rocket programs hadn't solved. The structural design that withstood extreme acceleration and aerodynamic stress during launch demonstrated advanced understanding of materials and forces. This intelligence influenced Allied rocket programs that accelerated after the war. The United States and Soviet Union both sought to capture German rocket scientists, equipment, and documentation, recognizing that German work provided years of advancement over their own programs. Operation Paperclip, the American program to recruit German scientists, ultimately brought over 1,600 German engineers and technicians to the United States, including Wernher von Braun and most of his Peenemünde team. The Soviet Union captured other engineers and the Mittelwerk production facility, using both to jumpstart their rocket program. The post-war careers of V-2 scientists, particularly von Braun, remain controversial. Von Braun became director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center and was principal architect of the Saturn V rocket that carried Apollo missions to the Moon. His technical contributions to American space exploration were enormous and are undeniable. But his role in V-2 development, his use of concentration camp labor, and his service to the Nazi regime created moral complexities that simple narratives of reformed Nazi scientists serving peaceful exploration don't adequately address. The V-2's military impact was minimal compared to its cost and the resources devoted to it. The approximately 9,000 deaths caused by V-2 strikes were tragic, but represented a tiny fraction of casualties from conventional bombing. The psychological impact was significant but didn't break British morale or affect British war strategy. The economic impact of diverting resources to V-2 production was arguably more harmful to Germany than the weapons were to Britain, representing a spectacular misallocation of scarce resources in the war's final year, when Germany desperately needed conventional weapons for defense. But the technological impact was revolutionary and permanent. The V-2 established that guided ballistic missiles were technically feasible, that rockets could reach space, and that long-range precision strike capabilities were achievable with sufficient engineering effort. These demonstrations shaped post-war military technology development, leading directly to intercontinental ballistic missiles that defined Cold War strategy. The space programs of the United States and Soviet Union both descended directly from V-2 technology, using German engineers, captured hardware, and technical documentation as foundations for their own developments. The guidance systems developed for V-2 established principles still used in modern missiles. Inertial guidance using gyroscopes and accelerometers, autonomous flight control without external input, and analog computing for real-time trajectory calculation all originated with or were significantly advanced by V-2 development. Modern variants use digital rather than analog computers and achieve far greater precision, but the fundamental concepts trace to German engineering in the 1940s. The propulsion technology pioneered in V-2 development influenced post-war rocket engine design. The combustion chamber configurations, fuel injection systems, and cooling methods developed to prevent engine melting at extreme temperatures all became standard features in subsequent rockets. The American Redstone rocket, which launched America's first satellite and first astronaut, was essentially a scaled-up V-2 designed by von Braun and his team using knowledge gained from wartime development. The manufacturing techniques required for V-2 production, particularly precision machining of complex components and quality control for systems where single-point failures caused catastrophic results, influenced post-war aerospace manufacturing. The recognition that rocket systems required different quality standards than conventional weapons led to development of specialized manufacturing and testing procedures that became standard in aerospace industry. The operational experience of deploying, fueling, and launching V-2 missiles provided lessons that shaped Cold War missile basing strategies. The Germans discovered that mobile launch operations provided survivability that fixed launch sites didn't, that launch operations required specialized training and careful procedure following, and that logistics for cryogenic fuels presented unique challenges. These lessons influenced American and Soviet missile deployment concepts decades later. The last V-2 launch against London occurred on March 27, 1945, striking Orpington and killing one person. The final launch against any target came on March 29, striking Antwerp. By this point, Allied forces had overrun most launch areas, production facilities were being captured or destroyed, and Germany was collapsing. The V-2 campaign ended not because of Allied countermeasures, but because Germany lost the territory and resources necessary to continue operations. Post-war assessment by both sides concluded that the V-2 was a technical success and a strategic failure. The weapon worked as designed, achieving unprecedented capabilities and demonstrating technologies that would shape the next century of warfare and space exploration. But it didn't achieve military objectives commensurate with its cost, diverted resources from more effective weapons, and represented a triumph of propaganda requirements over rational military strategy. Germany would have been better served building conventional weapons, but Hitler's obsession with wonder weapons that would miraculously reverse military setbacks drove continued investment in programs like V-2 despite their questionable utility. The human cost of V-2 development and deployment creates impossible moral accounting. Approximately 9,000 people died from V-2 strikes. Over 20,000 forced laborers died producing V-2 missiles in the middlework. Thousands more died in other parts of the production and supply chain, from fuel production to transportation. The technological advances purchased with these deaths enabled both space exploration, generally considered humanity's greatest achievement, and intercontinental ballistic missiles, which created the possibility of human extinction. Whether the advances justify the costs, and whether scientists who created the weapons bear moral responsibility for how they were produced and used, remain debated questions without consensus answers. The V-2's legacy is visible in every rocket that launches today. The liquid fuel engines that power modern space launch vehicles descend directly from V-2 technology. The guidance systems that steer satellites to precise orbits evolved from V-2 inertial guidance. The structural designs that withstand launch stress use principles established during V-2 development. The manufacturing quality control systems that ensure reliability trace to lessons learned when V-2 production failures caused launch catastrophes. The operational procedures for handling dangerous propellants and complex pre-launch sequences all derive from V-2 operational experience. The first guided missile in history was a weapon of terror that killed thousands, a technical marvel that advanced multiple engineering fields, a strategic blunder that wasted resources Germany couldn't spare, and a foundation for technologies that enabled both space exploration and weapons capable of ending human civilization. It represented the best and worst of human capability: extraordinary ingenuity applied to destruction, technical excellence serving evil purposes, and innovation that transcended its immediate applications to shape decades of subsequent development. Wernher von Braun, reflecting on his career in a 1969 interview shortly after Apollo 11's successful moon landing, acknowledged the contradictions. The rocket worked perfectly. It just landed on the wrong planet. The glib comment captured the tension between technical achievement and moral failure that characterized V-2 development. The engineers who created it achieved extraordinary technical goals while serving monstrous purposes, and the rocket that killed thousands in London ultimately enabled humans to walk on the moon. History offers no simple judgment of such complexity, only recognition that the first guided missile changed warfare and space exploration in ways that its creators couldn't have anticipated, and that continue resonating today. The explosion in Chiswick on September 8, 1944, announced not just a new weapon but a new era in warfare and technology. The V-2 was first, both in its capabilities and its implications. Every guided missile, every space launch, every satellite orbit traces conceptual lineage to that first operational ballistic missile. The technology has evolved beyond recognition, with modern systems achieving precision and reliability that V-2 could never match. But the fundamental concept, that rockets could guide themselves to distant targets or reach space through autonomous control, was established by the weapon that struck without warning and killed without mercy. The first guided missile in history that was simultaneously humanity's greatest technical achievement and one of its most tragic failures.